Hi, everyone. We'll start in a moment because people keep coming in. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Raluca Dumitrescu. I'm the coordinator for cotton and garment programs at Global Labor Justice, and I have the honor of chairing this webinar. We were really pleased to see such a high number of registrations for this webinar, and also people coming from across different stakeholder groups. And even now we see on the line brands, MSIs, policymakers, government agencies. It's really important, and we're all very pleased that there's so much interest in Turkmenistan. Let me start by saying that we are hosting this webinar as the Cotton Campaign Coalition. We're a global coalition that brings together human and labor rights organizations, but also brand associations, responsible investors, and academics, all united to end forced labor in cotton supply chains in Central Asia with a focus on Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And we are here today to discuss a report that we launched earlier this month, a report which documents state-imposed forced labor in the annual cotton harvest in Turkmenistan, with findings from the 2025 harvest, and which also documents routes through which Turkmen cotton made with forced labor enters global supply chains. So today's discussion will really dive into the findings of the report and implications for global supply chains. And I'm extremely pleased to introduce to you to our distinguished panelists that you can see here on the screen. We have Ruslan Myatiev, director at Turkmen.news, Cara Priestley, international and thematic advocacy manager at Anti-Slavery International, Anasuya Syam, Human Rights and Trade Policy Director at the Human Trafficking Legal Center, Dr. Laura Murphy, who's currently a fellow at Harvard Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights, and Aynabat Yaylymova, Director at Progres Foundation. And one of my colleagues will share in the chat links where you can find more about our panelists' work and their organizations. And just to start us off, I would say we prepared a presentation portion and then we will open for questions. So please already, add your questions to the Q&A window as you hear the first remarks. And I would say let's start already with Ruslan at Turkmen.news, if we could spotlight just him. Turkmen.news is an independent media and human rights organization. They also monitor forced labor in Turkmenistan's cotton fields. And Turkmen.news has been a member of the Cotton Campaign Coalition for almost 12 years now. So Ruslan, if you could first walk us through the findings of the report and, in particular, what does it mean when we talk about state-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan cotton?
Thank you very much, Raluca. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ruslan Myatiev, founder and editor of Turkmen.news. We not only publish daily news from Turkmenistan, but we also investigate cases of grant corruption, raise cases of human rights violations, and monitor the use of forced labor. I'm holding this report. I'm so happy I'm holding it because we have spent so much time putting it together, but I'm not quite happy with its content because what it means, state-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan, it means tens of thousands of civil servants, among them school teachers, kindergarten nannies, bank employees, factory employees, telecom employees, any state organization whose employees are paid by the state, basically, by the government. So all of these people, every fall from the end of August until somewhere in end of November, they must pick cotton. They must pick cotton themselves, or they are obliged to pay money so that their managers can hire replacement pickers. But it's mandatory for all civil servants except for the law enforcement in Turkmenistan. When we say it's imposed and enforced by the government, we say it with a lot of evidence that we receive from our dedicated monitors in Turkmenistan. These people are trained on domestic labor laws and Turkmenistan's international labor rights commitments, the ILO conventions, for example. Among our monitors are the civil servants themselves who are forced to pick cotton. They provide us with different recordings, for example, from staff meetings when school directors or other managers gather them and tell them that the government has ordered civil servants helping the state picking cotton. So we are now going to split you into groups. Let's say if it's 100 teachers in a school, then they split that staff, the people, into 3 or 4 groups, and everybody takes weekly shifts. Usually it's at least twice a week for civil servants, for teachers in our case, but it also relates to doctors, for example. And on Sundays, 100% of staff must be on the cotton fields or pay money. People in Turkmenistan prefer to pay money because, picking cotton in the heat, and August and September are very hot in Turkmenistan. And it's physically difficult, hard labor. So they prefer to pay. And the pay is, we calculated, it varies depending on a particular organization, depending on the profession of people involved. It starts from $85 and can go up until $175 for the entire cotton season. But please, this amount may sound quite little to you, but please keep in mind that salaries in Turkmenistan are very, very low. On average, for example, a school teacher can earn $150, $200 per month. So a good portion of her or his salary, she or he must pay in order to be free from cotton. I said already that the forced labor system, the state-imposed forced labor system, impacts tens of thousands of civil servants. And unfortunately, women are most vulnerable in Turkmenistan when it comes to this system, because women are the ones, or the majority, that teach at schools or treat patients in the hospitals. Last year, we also observed, and it happens from year to year, that the officials also involve private entrepreneurs to pick cotton. For example, last year we recorded several cases in several regions when, for example, managers of bazaars would come to the merchants and demand money from them, or people, their staff, for example, and this way contribute to the cotton harvesting. Paying money fosters corruption in Turkmenistan, because no official at school or at the bank or at the factory shows the staff official papers. This is the order from the, let's say, regional governor, and this amount of money we need to pay so that our school or our bank or our factory is free from cotton. In some schools, for example, of the same size, managers, directors demand money from 20 people a day, yes, but nobody knows if actually 20 pickers are hired for this money. In most of the cases, and we have evidence for that, part of the money ends up basically in their pockets. Lastly, the entire system of cotton production is very unprofitable for farmers and leaves them in debt. You probably know that in Turkmenistan, all lands belong to the state. Yeah, farmers only lease the land, and they receive quotas. How much cotton or wheat they need to produce every year. It's the state that provides them with cotton seeds, with minerals, with chemicals, with fertilizers. It's the state that regulates, which farmers association gets access to irrigation water, etc., etc. Finally, it's the state that has the monopoly on purchasing cotton, and it defines the prices at which it buys cotton from the farmers. So the problem is that in the past several years already, this implementation of this quota is physically impossible. The Turkmen soil, the Turkmen land cannot bear that much, cannot yield that much cotton that is required by the government. And if you fail to meet that quota, if a farmer fails to meet that quota, then he needs to either financially cover the remaining part, or whatever he did not produce this season, he must produce it on top of the next year's quota, which is impossible. So that's why farmers massively give up on producing cotton and emigrate. Even today, going to Russia, which is at war with Ukraine, is more profitable, than producing cotton. In just about a month's time in Moscow or St. Petersburg, they earn more than they earn by producing cotton in a year in Turkmenistan. Next slide, please. When we say that it is state-imposed forced labor, in this report we put together the system, how it works, the top to down system, who gives orders, who then implements these orders, and up until the lowest part of this diagram, where you see how this chain of command goes down to the civil servants, basically. Orders come from the president himself. He defines how much cotton Turkmenistan as a whole must produce this coming season. And then this order is given to the deputy prime minister in Turkmenistan, who in his turn orders regional hakims or governors. Hakim is a Turkmen word. And each, basically, we have 5 velayats, 5 regions in Turkmenistan. Each region gets its own quota, depending on the size of arable land they have, depending on the size of population, etc., etc. Then they give orders already to city hakims, city governors or mayors, who pass this order down to different departments, be that Department of Education, Department of Healthcare, Department of Trade, Utilities, etc., etc., etc. And then those departments send those orders to the organizations that they supervise: schools, libraries, banks, etc., etc. This is, I think, it's a really good, example and very illustrative how the state-imposed system works in Turkmenistan. Next slide, please. I wanted to say a few words about trade unions in Turkmenistan. They are not protecting workers from forced labor. In fact, in many cases, they contribute to this system. I can give you an example. From the Soviet times in Turkmenistan, we have a practice when, for example, in state institutions, be that a school or a library, there has to be someone representing the trade union. And usually that person is a staff member of that organization, and usually it's the chief of staff. Yeah, in a particular school or a particular hospital. So when it comes to state-imposed forced labor system in those organizations, it's the chief of staff / representative of a trade union puts together the lists of people, employees, who must take turns and travel to the cotton fields or pay money to hire replacements. On some of the photos, you can see here that Turkmen public workers, civil servants, they do basically many other things that are not in their work job descriptions, and these all come on orders from the representative of the trade union / chief of staff. For example, they can watch horse riding and or for example, in March there was a big event on planting trees, dedicated to the Muslim New Year, Nowruz Bayram. We do have several trade unions. We have 14 sectoral and 6 regional trade unions, and they all form the National Center of Trade Unions of Turkmenistan, but none of them is independent. Basically, they are all this or other way controlled by the government. Next slide, please.
I think this is it.
Oh, from yes. If you have any particular questions, I'm happy to answer, and this report is also available online. I think we'll share it in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can pick up on some of the points you made during the Q&A. I specifically wanted to reference something you had on an earlier slide as we transition to the next speaker, Cara Priestley from Anti-Slavery International. You had noted, Ruslan, on the previous slide that the use of forced labor in Turkmenistan actually violates Turkmenistan's obligations under international law. So I think, Cara, the question to you is then, what exactly are those obligations? Like, where does Turkmenistan sit in the broader UN system? And I think more importantly, in what ways have UN and ILO bodies and mechanisms engaged with Turkmenistan on the issue of forced labor?
Thanks, Raluca. Yeah, if we could move to the next slide, that would be great. So yeah, as was clear from Ruslan's presentation, the ongoing use of state-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan raises serious concerns about the government's compliance with its international obligations. Now, the government has ratified a number of key international conventions. These include ILO Convention number 105, which explicitly prohibits state-imposed forced labor. But the findings from the 2025 monitoring really raise questions about the government's political will to meaningfully address this. So a key lever for then influencing this is international scrutiny. And a key question here is, as Raluca mentioned, how are these international bodies, such as the ILO, such as the UN human rights mechanisms, responding to these ongoing violations and engaging with the Turkmen government and vice versa? So the first thing to mention is that in 2023, the Turkmen government accepted engagement with the ILO, and this led to the development of a series of roadmaps for cooperation, which were focused on preventing forced labour and child labour in the cotton sector, and they included ILO monitoring of the cotton harvest. So we have to recognise that this was a really important and positive first step, and it demonstrated that sustained international pressure can really work. So this engagement came almost a decade after Advocacy by the Cotton Campaign and its partners. And during the first 2 years of the government of Turkmenistan's engagement with the ILO, we did see some preliminary steps from the government to reduce forced labour in the harvest. However, now, unfortunately, we're not seeing the progress that many had hoped for. And in fact, this year's findings from this harvest report actually point to backsliding, with the tentative measures that we saw in the 2023 and 24 harvests having been reversed. So this year, public authorities mobilised or extorted all categories of public sector employees without exception. If we could go to the next slide, please. And these concerns are not only being raised by the Cotton Campaign. So as Raluca mentioned, there is a strong and growing body of reporting from international authoritative bodies that echo the findings from the independent monitors and reinforce the urgent need for action. So the ILO itself has repeatedly raised concerns. In its most recent observation under Convention 105, the ILO Committee of Experts strongly urged the government to redouble its efforts to eliminate compulsory labour and highlighted the interference, that's government interference, with the ILO monitoring was observed in both 2025 and 2024. Likewise, the ILO Committee on the Application of Standards has urged the government to engage meaningfully with the ILO and with independent employer and workers' organisations within the roadmap process. And then across the UN human rights system as well, UN treaty bodies such as the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have also raised concerns about ongoing forced labour and child labour practices and made strong recommendations to the government on the reforms that are needed. So the issue is clearly not lack of clarity about what needs to happen. The recommendations are clear, but the problem is implementation. And unfortunately, the government is far from implementing the reforms that are needed to adequately address the root causes of forced labour. So that's why continued scrutiny from the international community remains essential. So it's really important that governments, international and independent employer and workers organisations and multilateral institutions engage with the government of Turkmenistan in these international forums, but also bilaterally to maintain that pressure and focus on ensuring that the reforms address the structural drivers of forced labour and also emphasise the need for a wider enabling of human rights to ensure that any change is sustainable. Thank you.
Thanks, Cara. I think, the remarks you provided on the ILO and the UN piece, I think are a really good start to begin placing Turkmenistan in the international arena. I would suggest now we slightly shift gears and we start talking about supply chain links between Turkmenistan and other countries. And when I say countries, I'm actually referring here to markets, right? Markets in which products made with Turkmen cotton are imported and sold. I will spoil it for the people watching us now. Some of those countries are in the European Union, where the forced labor regulation, a piece of legislation which bans the import and sale of products made in whole or in part with forced labor, will come into full implementation at the end of next year. And we had a special guest today, Anna Cavazzini, a member of the European Parliament, who's been a strong supporter and promoter of such a law, and she was even involved in the drafting of a model law to ban imports of forced labor products in the EU. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it today, but she sent us a recorded message to help us frame the conversation. So I would really like to show that to you all before we move to the other portion of the discussion. So if you bear with me, I'm going to share my screen once more so that we can all watch the video.
Dear all, I'm so sorry that I cannot join your webinar, but I'm happy to share a few remarks as I appreciate the Cotton Campaign's tireless efforts to combat forced labor, and in this case also state-imposed forced labor, a cause that demands our urgent attention and collective action. The scale of this issue is staggering. Globally, an estimated 28 million people are trapped in forced labor, with 4 million of those cases imposed by states. And the findings of your new report, they're sobering and undeniable. State-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan's cotton supply chain is not a distant abstraction. It is a problem that touches the EU's markets, European retailers, and ultimately the EU's shared responsibility as consumers, policymakers, and also global citizens. So your report's revelations underscore its necessity. Turkmenistan's government continues to enforce widespread, systematic state-imposed forced labor during its annual cotton harvest. And this, unfortunately, is not an isolated abuse. It is institutionalized exploitation. Without the relentless work of civil society organizations, particularly those in the cotton campaign, this injustice might have remained hidden and the forced labor ban might have never become a reality. And I'm proud that during the last legislative period, we succeeded together in introducing the EU's product ban on forced labor. Yet, the fight is far from over. The implementation of this ban and a firm, unyielding stance against state-imposed forced labor will be critical to eradicating human rights abuses from our value chains and also from our supply chains, as there is no remediation possible in case of state-imposed forced labor, as is the case in Turkmenistan. This will only be possible through full disengagement. Thank you for your dedication to this cause. I wish you a productive and very inspiring webinar.
Great. Always great to see MEP Cavazzini speaking so passionately about the need to end forced labor in supply chains. Anasuya, let's pass now to you, Anasuya Syam from Human Trafficking Legal Center. If you can, in a few sentences, if you can share with us reflections in terms of what resonated with you from the MEP Cavazzini's video message, and what exactly are the links between Turkmen cotton and European markets, and also beyond that, if we look at other jurisdictions, if you can share a few words on that.
Great, thank you. I think for me, what struck me most from MEP Cavazzini's remarks, which were excellent, was that it underscored what the cotton campaign has been trying to highlight for years, which is that forced labor in Turkmenistan's cotton sector is not an abstract human rights issue occurring somewhere far removed from global business operations, right? It is not an isolated problem that is just confined within Turkmenistan's borders. Through complex international textile and apparel supply chains, cotton harvested under conditions of state-imposed forced labor are entering global markets through yarn, fabric, and finished goods manufactured in third countries. The supply chain maps in the Cotton Campaign's report just published demonstrate how the Turkmen cotton moves through major textile manufacturing and trading hubs, particularly in Turkey and Pakistan, which is emerging as a leading importer of Turkmenistan cotton, before it enters European and other international markets through fabric, garments, home textiles, and intermediary suppliers that are linked to all of the above. So the report identifies trade and sourcing links connecting Turkmen cotton inputs to production networks in countries that supply apparel and textile goods to the EU. There are, of course, as the map shows, EU countries that directly source from the region, including Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Belgium, as you can see in the map here. But what the report mainly underscores is that European brands and retailers, as well as other international brands, face significant indirect exposure risks, even when there is no direct sourcing from Turkmenistan. So therefore, the absence of direct sourcing relationships with Turkmen producers does not eliminate either risk or responsibility. So what makes the Turkmen case especially significant for global brands and retailers is that this is not something that occurs in a single farm or factory. As mentioned earlier, the forced labor system is embedded within the governance structure of the cotton sector itself. And this cotton industry in Turkmenistan is vertically integrated and state-controlled. And as the Cotton Campaign has noted in its years of advocacy, almost all cotton originating in Turkmenistan is produced within this system. So the report has identified Turkey as the largest importer and processing hub for Turkmen cotton, yarn, and fabric. And as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan is another country that we've identified through our supply chain research, which has imported significantly from Turkmenistan in recent years. And all of this is from publicly available trade data, including UN Comtrade, Panjiva, Import Genius, and all of these other trade databases. And what it highlights is that Turkmenistan remains a significant global cotton producer, I believe the 14th largest cotton producer in the world, and its exports continue flowing into regional manufacturing hubs that supply major international apparel and home textile markets. So this creates substantial downstream risk for brands sourcing from the mills in Turkey, in Pakistan, and in these manufacturing hubs that receive Turkmenistan cotton. One thing I did want to highlight is why is all of this significant? And I know the next speaker, Laura Murphy, will talk about it in more detail, but the issue of forced labor is no longer confined to voluntary corporate social responsibility initiatives or CSR initiatives. Regulatory expectations are changing rapidly, and governments are increasingly adopting forced labor import bans and mandatory due diligence frameworks. The United States banned the importation of all Turkmen cotton and cotton products 8 years ago in 2018, citing forced labor concerns and the research that underpins it. In recent years, US has intensified enforcement under Section 307 of the US Tariff Act, which is the general forced labor prohibition, as well as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Canada and Mexico also have import prohibitions against goods made with forced labor as per the terms of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and all three countries are supposed to coordinate on enforcement of the import ban. Similarly, as MEP Cavazzini noted, the European Union's forced labor regulation is going to enter into effect on 14th December 2027. And along with the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it is shaping expectations for supply chain due diligence. So given recent developments in the US and elsewhere, given the trade investigations that are ongoing, we are probably looking at more than 10 countries in the next year or two that will probably have similar market restrictions on products made with forced labor. So against this backdrop, conducting human rights due diligence in relation to state-imposed forced labor is just a vastly different exercise when compared to privately imposed forced labor. And again, probably something that other speakers will get into in more detail. But one thing is clear, that is supply chain mapping must move beyond tier one suppliers. Companies should have visibility into cotton origin, yarn sourcing, and fabric conversion stages, especially when sourcing from countries known to import Turkmen cotton inputs. As the experience with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act shows, diving deeper into one's supply chains is actually not as inconceivable as brands have claimed in the past. MEP Cavazzini also underscored the importance of collective action in her recorded remarks. No single company or country can solve a state-imposed forced labor system alone. Responsible disengagement, CSO monitoring, investor pressure, and government enforcement all play essential roles. The Cotton Campaign's Turkmen Cotton Pledge, for example, represents one example of coordinated industry action intended to reduce demand for cotton linked to forced labor. And all of these regulatory measures are intended to shrink the market for forced labor and profitability from these types of abuses. On enforcement cooperation, I think the US should step up and use the USMCA forced labor commitments to coordinate with Canada and Mexico, and by sharing shipment risk indicators, its entity lists, importer data, and detention outcomes to prevent goods which are rejected in one market, say the United States, from being rerouted through another. With the EU, the coordination should focus on early alignment before the EU forced labor regulation comes into effect in 2027. And the EU ban will cover products made with forced labor, whether imported or sold in the EU market. So a joint US, Canada, Mexico, EU approach could include common risk advisories on Turkmen cotton, shared supplier watch lists, coordinated inquiries to brands sourcing from Turkey and other hubs, and recognition of Cotton Campaign monitoring as credible civil society evidence for opening investigations. So the global textile industry has reached a point where plausible deniability is no longer sustainable. The evidence linking Turkmen cotton to forced labor is extensive and long-standing, and the policy environment is shifting towards stricter enforcement. Stakeholders, consumers, investors, regulators, and workers themselves are increasingly expecting companies to demonstrate credible action and not just aspirational, statements or reporting. And with that, maybe I'll close my remarks and open it up to questions. So over to you, Raluca.
Thanks, Anasuya. Before we have an open Q&A, I'd actually like to bring in Laura. Here, you already mentioned Laura Murphy. She's an academic and expert in state-imposed forced labor. Laura, you've done tremendous work to call for mapping of supply chains. You've advocated for legislation to ban forced labor products from entering global markets, and with a particular focus on forced labor of Uyghur and other minorities by the Chinese government in Xinjiang and beyond. And Laura, you've just recently published a paper called An International Blueprint for Forced Labor Import Bans. So I wanted to ask you, based on your research and based on building on the points Anasuya made in terms of the need to map and trace supply chains beyond Tier 1 and in terms of the need for collective action across jurisdictions, what do you think, what could really an effective implementation of the EU forced labor regulation could achieve? And if we move beyond the EU and we look at jurisdictions like the US, what lessons could we learn from efforts made there until now to ban imports of forced labor products?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. And I've been really appreciating this presentation. I want to start by just congratulating Ruslan and everyone who's been involved in the Cotton Campaign on this work. It's an incredible report. I read it cover to cover. We don't usually do that, kind of skim things quickly. We all have many things to do. But it's a really compelling, though incredibly dire report. The evidence is rich and strong, and it's first person, and you have a real sense of the lives of the people who are undergoing this. And for me, it gave me a sense of the broader impact of having a system of state-imposed forced labor that affects every civil servant. Imagine if all of your doctors and nurses and teachers had to be out in the fields. And sure, some people will pay to get out of that situation, but it must have every person who's handling your taxes and your entitlements, every person in the civil service is disappearing for several months potentially. This could have a massive attack on the productivity of the nation in general, on the education of your children, especially if your children are having to go and pick cotton. So I thought the report really helped us to see the broader stakes, and it also really clearly shows that this cotton is going to the rest of the world. It's being made into apparel and towels and textiles that we're all consuming, and so I do think the stakes are extremely high, and I think the report really calls all governments to action to do something about this, because while groups like the Cotton Campaign or groups like those in the Cotton Campaign have been advocating for a decade now on this issue at least, what needs to step in, as Raluca has pointed out, as Anasuya has been talking about, is government action that holds companies accountable for continuing to source from this region when we know that there's systematic state-imposed forced labor, and that lends some teeth to the human rights calls to action, because what we know is that companies rarely actually change their behaviors, their purchasing practices, their supply chains, unless there's a consequence to it, unless there are negative consequences to keeping the status quo. And so we can be out there writing reports over and over and over again and documenting this stuff, but until governments step in, there's very little that companies will actually do. And so Raluca is asking, how can the EU make this work? What do we learn from the US? What's going on with the international forced labor enforcement world? Well, I think this report gives the EU a very strong roadmap for figuring out how to identify Turkmen cotton and enforce against it. If I had to predict, and I'm just guessing, if I had to predict, I think that the EU will, in June of this year, when they publish their new database of forced labor made products, I would predict that that state-imposed forced labor in Turkmen cotton will be on that list. And I predict that because they're being very systematic about looking at the evidence. And this report, in addition to years of evidence collected by the Cotton Campaign, have created a really compelling and undeniable evidence base to suggest that forced labor is happening in Turkmenistan. And so first step will be having the EU add this particular sector in this particular country into the database. And then the EU will need to very rapidly start looking at these supply chains that have been mapped out so well in this report to see what textiles are coming into Germany, into France, into Italy, which products can we stop? And they'll have to identify those importers who are likely to be bringing in the goods made with Turkmen cotton in third countries, in Turkey, in Pakistan. The US gives us a good model for this. I'll be honest and say that I don't know a ton about what the US has stopped from Turkmenistan, in part because they don't report on it in the same way they do report about the products made in the Uyghur region. But what we know about products being stopped from the Uyghur region, including in the apparel and textile industry, is that US enforcement has in fact compelled companies to shift their supply chains. And we see it happening all the time. We can see companies moving their supply chains, buying cotton from different places, buying their apparel from different places, diversifying their supply chains to meet the demands of the US government. That will happen when the EU, and it will expand, it will increase when the EU's law comes into effect. Furthermore, Canada and Mexico have these laws, as Anasuya said. In Indonesia, Pakistan, and El Salvador have all passed new forced labor import bans in the last 3 months. And I'd say there's at least a dozen more countries that are poised to do it, in part because the US is bullying them into doing it, but in part because it is the right thing to do. And people on this call have been advocating for it for years. And so I think that we will see like a larger global effort to stop these products from being imported. And I think Pakistan will be an interesting place to put pressure and say, okay, look, you've passed this law. We see these imports coming directly from Turkmenistan. This is a good place to start with implementing your law. And so I'll leave it there. There's a million things that we could talk about, but I'll leave it there, and maybe we'll have some more time to talk in the Q&A.
Thanks, Laura. That was such a comprehensive response. Let's pick up on some of the points in the Q&A. Let's open now for questions from people. We have about 12 to 14 minutes for that, and I see we already got 2 questions. So I can pass one of those. Let's see. Ruslan, maybe you could take that. From a member of the diplomatic community, we have a question. Do you have any thoughts on why there was a backsliding in 2025 in terms of the Turkmen government reversing some of the preliminary steps it had taken in previous harvests to reduce the number of people in forced labor?
Well, thanks for the question. We don't know for sure, and we would love to know what the reason was, but there are a few thoughts on that. First of all, it's as I said, the big quota that is given to regions. Yeah, they simply cannot meet those quotas. And unfortunately, the only solution that they have is sending more people. The soil does not produce that much cotton. Even if you send the entire country to pick cotton, there is simply no cotton in the fields. That's the problem. But of course, in this sense, the regional governors are final responsibles for these quotas. They will have to come to the president then at the end of November or in December and report that, Mr. President, we have fulfilled, the assignment. So in order to do that for them, they need to send more people. One of the speakers said, I think it was Cara, but I might be wrong. When the government did take some steps, with the ILO engagement, etc., they included, for example, cotton harvesting in the list of hazardous activities, and therefore people under the age of 18 were prohibited from doing it. It was a good step, but most importantly, and the easiest thing the government could have done when they started to engage with the ILO is for somebody high in the government, and in our case it's the president of Turkmenistan, to make a public statement on television, in the press, and say that from now on no state official forces civil servants to pick cotton. And if you are a civil servant and you are being forced to pick cotton, this is a clear mechanism where you can complain. That's it. Of course, it wouldn't solve the issue overnight, because it's a huge machine, creaking machine that has been running from the Soviet times. They are accustomed to the system. They don't probably know how to do it otherwise, or they don't have the capacities. But it would have reduced the number of people in the fields many fold. If we are talking now about tens of thousands of people throughout the country, had there been such a public statement by the president or someone else in the government, the number would have been much smaller. I hope that answers the question.
Let me also take advantage of this question, and since again it comes from a member of the diplomatic community, maybe Cara, I can pass this question to you in your role of conducting international advocacy. What do you think is, or what do you think members of the diplomatic community and governments should actually do at this moment in time to continue the pressure on the Turkmen government to actually take meaningful steps to address forced labor, especially at this time when we were seeing a slightly positive change and then it reversed?
Thanks, Raluca. Yeah, so I think one thing to emphasize is that government should really take this moment to increase their engagement and scrutiny with the government of Turkmenistan. This is a really critical time, and it's quite frankly the biggest opportunity that we have had to influence change in Turkmenistan with these small openings that we've seen in previous years. So it's more important than ever that all stakeholders kind of don't take their foot off the gas at this moment. So, I mean, one thing that governments can definitely do is reinforce with the Turkmen government, both in bilateral and multilateral human rights organizations, that forced labor must be eliminated. But not only that, the reforms need to be sustainable and meaningful. So this issue goes beyond kind of quote unquote merely reducing the number of workers in the fields. Whilst that's hugely important, government should highlight to the government of Turkmenistan that inherent in the labour reforms needs to be the inclusion of fundamental rights, civil and political rights, that can ensure that we have things like freedom of association, freedom of expression, because without these, any labour reforms are ultimately not going to be sustainable. And we have, many things coming up, International Labour Conference, a potential review by Turkmenistan, by the Committee on the Application of Standards. There are lots of opportunities for governments to ensure that we really use this moment to have a strong review of Turkmenistan and keep that scrutiny on them.
Thanks. I see here a second question. Do we know if there is more Turkmen cotton, yarn, or fabric going to Turkey and Pakistan? And if cotton, do you know how much it is being blended? So what we know, and this is also presented in the report. So again, we encourage everyone, please check the report and the maps we have included there. When it comes to Turkey, it's really yarn. That's the #1 import from Turkmenistan, cotton yarn, which is soon followed by fabric, and only after that, raw cotton on the 3rd place. And when it comes to Pakistan, we have fabric as the #1 import, followed by yarn. in terms of how much is being blended or how much is this yarn or fabric being woven into finished products, we don't know. That's the catch. That's why we're calling on companies to map and trace their supply chains and understand at which levels and through which sub-suppliers Turkmen cotton or products made with Turkmen cotton enter their supply chains. I wonder, maybe Laura, you could come in here as a follow-up, maybe to provide a few more reflections, because we hear this question quite often from people in the sourcing space and business space when we engage. For example, they're saying, why are we calling on them to eliminate Turkmen cotton or cotton made with state-imposed forced labor at all stages of the supply chain? Why are we not saying, as in other cases, well, you should stay and you should, use your leverage to remediate forced labor and prevent forced labor? What's so different about these specific cases of state-imposed forced labor?
Yeah, I'm glad you're emphasizing that. Because I think a lot of people have, including many of us on this call, have for decades advocated for, not having companies cut and run, for having companies really engage in meaningful remediation. And that has been really important work. And it seems to have sunk in into companies' ethics processes, into how they engage with forced labor when they do engage with situations of forced labor. But state-imposed forced labor is different. And even the people who have spent their entire lives trying to inculcate this idea of not cutting and running and engaging in real remediation, those people are the people who said state-imposed forced labor is different. You do not have the leverage to work with companies and try to get them to change their practices when the government is mandating not just the people, but that the companies engage in these practices. The farmers, the farms, the textile industry, all of them are in the system. And so there's no way that a company can go in and work with a single textile manufacturer in Turkmenistan and say, don't source from Turkmenistan. You can't work with a farm on the ground there. One day we hope you can. And we hope that there'll be advances, including through this work, to change the situation on the ground in Turkmenistan. I think everyone on this call will celebrate that day and will let you know when that happens. There's no question. But for now, companies do not have that leverage, and they have to simply exit immediately from any relationship they have that's involved with Turkmen cotton.
Thanks. I see we have another question here, specifically about supply chains and Turkey and Pakistan, in particular as countries that facilitate the entry of Turkmen cotton into the market. Would it be possible to raise awareness about this issue among labor activists in those countries? Have you made any efforts in this regard, or do you plan to, and what's the reaction you've gotten from them? I would say this is a really great question and an important point to start thinking about when we talk about transnational campaigning and solidarity. At the same time, to be clear, we have not engaged until now towards a point as the one describing here, to engage with the labor movement in these specific countries or workers in these manufacturing facilities to start tracking and getting evidence of Turkmen cotton products coming into those factories. And there's a very clear answer for that, or clear to us until now, which is that without a considerable campaign or without getting a brand in, to be able to use its leverage with that specific supplier to make sure that Turkmen cotton is eliminated from its own products, we think that the people on the ground involved in any kind of effort or campaign like that will simply not have enough protection. We know that Turkey and Pakistan are not particularly good environments for labor rights from many perspectives. For example, even one of our partners, Ruslan here on the panel, has actually he's gotten a travel ban imposed on him by the Turkish government, and we know it was at the request of the Turkmen government. So that gives you a sense of how tight not just the business but also the political relationships are between these countries. And again, I'm going back to the findings in the report. Turkey is really the #1 importer of cotton products from Turkmenistan. So clearly that comes with risks when we talk about involving workers or unions on the ground in this type of work. Does anyone want to add something to that? Ruslan, do you want to add? Or Anasuya, a few points on that to complement?
Oh, no, Ruslan, go ahead
remarks.
first. I was going to add on something else. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate a bit on the ban. It was in 2024. My family and I went to Turkey for private, for leisure. And as soon as they scanned my passport, they took me to a different room where two security officers questioned me for 4 hours. And like 85-90% of their questions were about my work with the UN, for instance. I don't know why. Of course, I know why, but they saw something they read something on their computers and on their phones, and kept asking me questions. Who finances me when I travel to the UN in Geneva? Who tells me what to say there? Great question, but. The funniest thing is that they probably thought that I don't understand Turkish, and when in the very beginning they saw who I was and what the entire issue was about, they said one to the other one, said Turkmenistan'dan geldi. So the request came from Turkmenistan. So I noted it for myself and nodded, and after 4 hours they put me back on the plane, and my family stayed. I returned to the Netherlands where I live.
Thanks. I see we still have a few questions in the Q&A. I invite our panelists, if you could provide brief answers in writing, or otherwise we'll follow up when we share the webinar recording. Because really in the last few minutes of the webinar, I would like to bring in our colleague Aynabat Yaylymova from Progres Foundation. Aynabat, you're here. Okay, if we can please spotlight Aynabat. Final words, right? Please bring us back to the core of the problem. As a Turkmen yourself, leading from the diaspora, an organization dedicated to human rights and to change in Turkmenistan, and also having worked on the report we discussed here today. What are your reflections about the way forward, about things like roles that different stakeholder groups should play to pressure the Turkmen government to end forced labor of its citizens?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Raluca. I will need probably 20 hours to talk about that, but I'll try to be short. So I apologize for the noise coming from the street. I have no control over that. So yes, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Aynabat, and I work with Turkmen researchers and experts to highlight human development in Turkmenistan. We at Progres Foundation are proud of our coalition work with Turkmen and international partners. It's a work that highlights, as you can see, it's a work that highlights structural governance issues related to labor rights and helps Turkmens develop recommendations and constructive engagements on critical issues. Just a few thoughts to share and kind of to conclude, maybe to help to conclude such an extensive work, conversation on our extensive work, is that any business, any government that does business with the government of Turkmenistan is stepping into the territory of profound human misery and neglect. Autocratic rule from Ashgabat systematically degrades human agency and well-being. It's a man-made suffering driven by the government's resistance to reform and its deep aversion to economic modernization. What we told you today in data with policy analysis, talking points, is a story of hundreds of Turkmen farmers, children, women, and men who have been trapped in this endless cycle of poverty and violence, compounded by ongoing depopulation and environmental degradation in Turkmenistan. So the business as usual investments will be contributing to maintaining this unstable, dangerous, and short-term status quo. The government, our continued monitoring with the coalition, with the campaign, with the cotton campaign, and outside of cotton campaign, shows that the government has no vision for reform. At this point, it has become a victim of its own repressive policies. It has successfully engineered a fully compliant and fearful citizen. The decimated state institutions neither have public trust, mandate, nor administrative resources to govern. This is happening, just let me remind you that this is happening while many Turkmens continue to disappear for speaking up. There are about over 160 documented cases of enforced disappearances, and the list with new cases of transnational repression is growing. So this is not the time for more workshops for bureaucrats leading to no reforms. This is, as my colleagues noted, and I would like to highlight, this is the critical time to build economic pressure on autocratic kleptocracy and target the financial lifelines of corrupt Turkmen elites and rogue businesses that sustain them. This is the time to exert sustained pressure on the Turkmen government to abolish state-imposed forced labor, clearly and loudly, and not by whispering it to the ears of a few select international organizations and delegations. The social contract of Turkmen citizens and the government, the progress should not be measured by our mere physical survival at the hand of the tyrannical regime. It should be measured by our ability, by Turkmen's ability to flourish, to create and contribute to the development of their society and the country. So engagement in economic cooperation with the government must be conditional. Any aid investment without government's demonstrated commitment to reforms, demonstrated to the public, not just to international community, will enrich a few and further deepen human suffering inside the country. You must remember this is that the government of Turkmenistan draws its legitimacy and funding to enable repression at home from your institutions, from international cooperation. So each of us has a role to play. Our report spells out recommendations and possibilities. So please join our call for the humane Turkmen government that prioritizes basic dignity, welfare of, and accountability to its citizens. Thank you.
Aynabat, would you still like me to show the photo you sent?
Yes. So this is
for
one thing.
Few seconds.
Yeah, a few seconds, just 30 seconds. So, in our work, a lot of Turkmens through social media, through their engagement via social media, our accounts, they ask us for good news. So just to kind of reflect on this, this would be the good news to see this coming from Turkmenistan, and to explain. We keep explaining that we're not against the cotton production in Turkmenistan. We do not want to kill the industry. This is what we want to see, and the government's public acknowledgement of the issues would be very good news from Turkmenistan.
Thanks, Aynabat. This photo is too good, so I don't want to stop sharing my screen. We are at time, though. We're actually 3 minutes past. Thank you all for joining us today. Just so you know, we'll circulate a recording of the webinar in the next few days, and I think my colleague has posted my email address in the chat if you all have comments or would like to learn more about this issue moving forward. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll be in touch. Bye.